So thank you first and foremost. Thank you very much for having me. I am the slight outlier here. My accent gives me away a little bit. My name's Tim Worledge, and I'm part of the agriculture team here at Fastmarkets. I work across the agri-sensors and energy sensors brands, and I work closely with the Jacobson team. I'm very pleased to be part of this inaugural virtual conference that brings together all of these diverse talents for the first time. And really hopefully building on the fine trail that's already been blazed by the Jacobson in their physical events over the last few years. I'm very proud to be part of this appetizer as well. I'll be talking about some of the expectations around the EU's aviation initiatives, but I'm going to give you a quick first introduction to Fastmarkets and where we fit into all of this. I hope that's not too indulgent, but I have a second presentation in about an hour's time, so I'll try and pare this back for the second time round. Well, Fastmarkets has its roots in early price reporting efforts across the metals industry, and is able to trace itself right back to 1882, which is nearly as far back as the Jacobson. However, it is very much a 21st century endeavour. Much of the growth and the expansion and diversification for the company has come in from 2001 onwards. Over the last few years in particular, that expansion has kicked into a higher gear and has consolidated the metals coverage, but now also branched out into a series of additional commodity spaces through new acquisitions, primarily starting in the forestry area, which is an interesting angle to bring in given the state of biofuels and some of the potential feedstock conversations now. I personally joined Fastmarkets in 2020 through the acquisition of Census Commodity Data. We were an upstart startup that aimed to provide news and pricing to the bulk agriculture space via our AgriSensus daily report. It became apparent quite quickly that ags and biofuels go hand in hand, and as part of our launch, we also founded a UK-focused agency looking at the biofuel requirements for the UK called Energy Census, with a view to catering for an industry need within the UK's renewable transport fuel obligation, which is kind of the equivalent of the RFS. I'll speak a little bit more on that later in my presentation on UK, but one of the exciting elements of UK biofuel development is an early move towards acknowledging the issues around aviation. As I said, it's the sore thumb that increasingly is sticking out in amongst biofuel policy. And after our acquisition, the Jacobson has followed earlier this year, and we are now able to start bringing together some of the near 160 years of pricing history and experience into the mix, alongside the insights and the analysis that will be on display today and in August, and all of that infuses into our combined output on a daily basis. One of the more exciting things to flag as well is that as part of Fastmarkets, we have access now to insights, pricing and expertise on battery metals. And also in our forestry coverage, we have a deep well of experience in what could prove to be another exciting new feedstock in both diesel and sustainable aviation fuels production. And so to that end, I'm going to flag here that we are working on more content that we hope to publish between now and our August event that will give you even more insights into that. And we shall have more on that in the not too distant future, I hope. Moving on. This is the agenda. It's just starting by framing the situation, why aviation is where it's at in the biofuel debate. We'll consider some of the legislative framework that's coming into play, the impact that it could have on feedstocks, and finally we'll consider some of the solutions that are vying to provide fuels for future transportation. I'm going to start with this because this is always one of my favorites. This is what I call the nerd slide. This is the bit where we talk a little bit more technical about aviation itself. It's probably been a long time since any of us have been on an aeroplane, so we may have forgotten the miracle of what it is to propel something that weighs the best part of 400 tons at just under the speed of sound at a height of about 40,000 feet, 5 or 6 miles up. And in terms of monitoring, managing and controlling emissions, this sort of technological innovation is one of the few levers that the industry has had to bring some of those changes. Perhaps the only significant response that airlines have been able to invest in response to both price pressures from strong oil prices, mineral jet fuel prices, and the need to demonstrate reductions in emissions. So this is the business end of an A350, which is the Airbus equivalent of Boeing's 787 Dreamliner. It is essentially made of plastic with a composite spine that gives it additional strength. It is very strong, it is very light, and it makes it far more efficient. And such has been the success of this class of aircraft that it has effectively drawn down the curtain on the age of the super jumbo. Airbus has stopped producing its double-decker A380. Major airlines like British Airways recently announced that it had retired its entire Boeing 747 fleet, and the airline had been the biggest operator of the classic jumbo jet up until that point. But it's a simple equation. The aircraft, on average, burns 5 tons of fuel an hour at its cruise altitude versus 10 to 11 tons of fuel that the average 747 would burn. Now, to some extent, that's because the 747 has 4 engines, and the Airbus and the Dreamliner have 2. But equally, you can see there's huge advantages on distance that it will cover, its range as well. These aircraft will do over 10,000 miles versus around 8,500 miles on the average 747. So that's one of the things that you'll see when you do get to go back to an airport, is you'll see more and more of these twin-engined aircraft tend to be quite easily identifiable because they have very flexible wings. You can see some of the innovations there they've gone on. There's a picture of a winglet, which are entirely designed to help reduce drag and again boost the efficiency. Some of these changes are already happening and are already in place. And as I said, I dare say the next time you go to your local airport to jet off somewhere, you will be flying on something that is a lot more fuel efficient than you would have been flying on perhaps prior to lockdowns. So in terms of decarbonising aviation, some of the options that are available have been relatively limited. Aviation has led something of a sheltered life when it comes to being accountable for emissions. International travel has been a particularly sore point, as questions over who takes responsibility for mid-Atlantic emissions are much harder to resolve. But shipping, that occupies a similar grey area, has found measures that have begun to address its carbon footprint, and the aviation sector is increasingly left standing alone. So there are options to decarbonise. We've talked about the technological design, but there are other significant factors such as electricity power, which are a very long way away, and perhaps potentially, certainly there's no heavy lift or long haul options in hybrid electric aircraft, even on the drawing board at this scale, at this stage. So fuel is going to be the key. We can talk a little bit about managing demand as well, and we can talk a bit about some of the well, we've already talked a little bit about some of the improvements in aircraft efficiency through design. Globally, and the statistic on the left, on the right-hand side, says only 2% of greenhouse gas emissions are traced back to aviation, which seems like a relatively small amount, but the scale of growth that this sector has undergone over the last few decades, greenhouse gas emissions have doubled in the space of the last 30 years, and the sort of projections for growth, even after the impact of COVID, the projections for growth are fairly impressive. So there is a pressing need here that becomes increasingly evident as the industry recovers after the sector. There is as the industry recovers after the COVID lockdowns. There is another thing to bear in mind with Europe as well, and this is they have seen some use of biofuels, but the holy grail of getting a biofuel adopted in the aviation space is to get it to a drop-in quality. Much of Europe's jet fuel supply is managed by the CEPS, the Central Europe Pipeline System. So you have some key points at, this is an old NATO pipeline that would have once fueled the Cold War and is now being used to connect many of Europe's biggest airports to either key refining capacity up in the Rotterdam area or some of the key importing facilities on the English Channel and the North Sea coast. Any fuel that goes into this network needs to be drop-in quality. It needs to be effectively chemically identical to the DEFSTAN A1 that will come out of an oil refinery. So that sets the standard pretty high. Talk a little bit about demand management. This is my nerd picture again. The one at the top was taken in April 2020. It's a screen grab from an app that I have myself, and you can see the sky, this is taken about 4 o'clock in the afternoon on an April day, and the skies over Europe are virtually empty. That should be roughly, under normal circumstances, those skies should be roughly akin to what you can see over North America. The continent effectively blanked out by small yellow silhouettes of aircraft active. This is post-lockdown across much of the European region. It's probably pre-lockdown in the US, so you can see there's much more normal levels of activity over there. I restaged the picture a couple of days ago in preparation for this, and you can see the number of aircraft above European skies has recovered, but arguably it looks to me like the amount of air traffic active in North America has declined as well. So there's a little bit of rebalancing going on there, but some of the statistics that the industry itself has put forward, a 68% decline in capacity according to IATA, one of the leading lobby groups for the industry, and a 75%, more nearly 76% decline in actual passenger demand, are just unsustainable in themselves. So there has been a degree of demand management. There has been a degree of demand management on the back of COVID and lockdowns, but is it a long-term viable solution to the problem? Can we credibly expect to roll back the growth of aviation and reel in expectations that international travel is something that is almost, it's not really a human right, but it's almost that level of accessibility people expect to be able to get on a plane and travel overseas? It seems unlikely we're going to be able to put those expectations back and try and adapt to a world without aviation of some form. So it is a burning issue that needs to get some redress. And as I mentioned earlier, some of the alternate human transportation mechanisms have already found alternatives that are being pursued quite actively now, quite aggressively. So you've got battery and hybrid technology for cars and light vans. Certainly in the European region, we're starting to pursue gas-based powertrains for some of the heavy vehicles and buses, etc. And there's some electrification in that as well. Hydrogen is also a potential option, which is also sometimes linked to aviation. But the raw bottom line is that aviation remains outside many of these solutions, and oil ticks many boxes that are essential to the industry. Raw horsepower that is required to lift hundreds of tons. It's relatively inert, it's easy to transport, and it performs at altitude. It is a hostile environment at 40,000 feet, so you need that to perform consistently and regularly in a way that people will know. I'm going to mention hydrogen very quickly. It's a little bit of an insensitive picture, and if there's anyone from the hydrogen marketing board on here, they're going to be horrified to see this. Hydrogen in the aviation context has not had a great history. This is the Hindenburg. There is a debate. There is a division of opinion as to whether hydrogen played a role in this disaster or not. But there are challenges around hydrogen in the aviation space. We are starting to hear, only today, in fact, in the UK paper, The Guardian, they are highlighting an airship-based solution, which I think is actually using helium. And is backed by the lead singer of Iron Maiden, but they're talking about the ability of airships to provide some sort of short haul functionality, which would be at a much lower emissions rating. It still sounds like it's a little bit of a long way off, and there's going to be some fundamental changes of expectations. If you're looking to fly from Liverpool to Belfast, for example, the company says that would take about 5.5 hours versus a flight time now of about 40 minutes. So there is going to have to be a fundamental change of mindset if these sorts of options are going to work. The flip side is that if they are calculating themselves that it would save 90% emissions on that journey, and that 47% of regional flights are actually less than 200 miles or less than 230 miles in distance. So that's an area where potentially electric or hydrogen/helium based lifting can provide some sort of alternative, but it's still a long way off, and it's still very much on the drawing board. So there are some ambitious figures being touted, and it's important to note that part of the option, part of the opportunity comes from the fact that there is so little biofuel currently making its way into the aviation landscape, particularly in the European Union. 0.05% of total supply, as I mentioned earlier, is actually sustainable. and that amounts to around about 100,000 tons a year, according to the European Union. So that is, as the union itself acknowledges, that is largely untapped. So scope for improvement, but to put that into perspective, I used to cover jet fuel when I was a younger price reporter, and I think back then, pre-COVID, Heathrow alone, the UK's primary airport hub, Heathrow alone used to burn 15,000 tons of jet fuel every day. So current production across the entire block amounts to less than a week's supply to one busy international hub. That's the scale of the challenge that lies ahead. More pertinently, we're starting to see moves to write these expectations into law, or at least into corporate goals as well, to set mandates and to drive expectations, with some companies mulling a net zero by 2050 aspirational target. The EU at this stage isn't going quite that far. They're looking for a proposal. They're mulling a proposal to reduce emissions by 90% versus the 1990 baseline by 2050. But again, we're less than 30 years away from that target. So that is still, given the lead time that goes into technology, given the lead time that goes into fuels, given the lead time and investment time that's required, that's still a fairly aggressive target. We can talk a little bit about the UK as well. At this point, there is a bit of a divergence between what the UK is doing and what the EU is doing. Where we used to be part of the EU, they all would have been bundled together, and we would have worked to whatever Brussels required. Today, we are an independent country again. The UK has signalled that it is looking to move to a jet zero position, and it's providing some funding towards those. There are some projects underway in the UK, but they are still at very early stages. But I think there are some barriers, and the European Union has highlighted that through some of its research. Perhaps no great surprises here, but amongst the challenges that they're facing are the higher production cost for the fuel itself. That makes it an uneconomic substitute. It's an eternal problem with biofuels. It's writ large in aviation terms, perhaps because the airlines find it harder to pass those costs on, and because of the additional scrutiny that goes around jet fuel. The key that the European Union has identified is scale, and that if you can encourage the production of these fuels in volume, that will bring them into a much more realistic economic ballpark, I guess. Feedstock volatility is, I think Bob talked a little bit about this as well. Feedstock volatility, particularly in the oilseed sector, that's a great big uncertainty that is affecting a lot of outlooks. There's a lack of an existing binding target, and that also deters investment. If you haven't got a clear idea where the roadmap is heading, it makes it hard to put large sums of money behind it into developing the sort of capacity that's going to be needed. So they've identified that as a barrier. Feedstock availability, I mean, that kind of ties in with the volatility as well. Again, there's limited upside, and as Bob noted earlier, the European Union is discouraging the use of feed and food-based crops in these fuels, so that's going to further restrict the potential supply pool. But there's also competition from existing capacity and existing uses. As Bob noted, the European Union has, I think, the biggest proportion of biodiesel capacity at the moment, and a lot of that reflects the fact that we have broadly we've been much more comfortable with a diesel car than perhaps petrol or gasoline. So it's natural that there is a big biodiesel demand here. It has got very sophisticated, and it's got very quick to adopt waste-based fuels like used cooking oil, and these are all going to compete directly with some of the aviation areas. The fuel approval process can be expensive and very long as well. Again, that's what's at stake is so great. It's vital that there is it's vital that there is a robust system that monitors and ensures the fuels come up to what's required of them. That can take a long time, and that can be a deterrent for producers as well. It's much easier to put it into a biodiesel where there are less consequences if your car fuel doesn't work as comfortably than there are perhaps at 40,000 feet. And there's also no process in place to monitor the use of sustainable aviation fuels by airlines. So it's very hard to say I'm achieving these goals and I'm hitting these targets because we have no real mechanism. And that's going to be harder to monitor once stuff does start going into a system like the sort of pipeline network that underpins much of the European supply. Nonetheless, in doing that, the union has been able to identify potential areas where it could have an impact, and I think the tried and trusted mechanism of a blending mandate of some sort is one of those that many people are hopeful of. So the expectation is you start small with that and you build up over time to something a lot more ambitious. There's no firm details at the moment, but the rumors anticipate a potential 2% mandate by 2025. So 2% of all jet fuel being blended in is expected to be sustainable, rising to 5% in 2030, 20% by 2035, 32% by 2040, and then a giant leap to 63% by 2050. These are rumors. These are figures that have been mulled. There's nothing hard and fast yet that has been put forward. Revision, a multiplier approach as well. So actually being able to encourage the use of these fuels by making them carry more weight in the emission savings. That's another mechanism that could be used. Again, that's another tried and trusted mechanism that has been used to promote certain types of biofuel adoption. There's a central auction mechanism, which I think is designed to try and get around problems of how suppliers find the marketplace and the right value. I think that's largely based on a renewable electricity approach. Funding is another favorite, direct funding using EU money to actually invest in some of the technology that needs to be put forward. And prioritization is another one that is potentially very controversial. Because aviation, the argument is that aviation has a much more pressing need than perhaps the car fleet, where there are alternatives to actively discourage the use of some of these feedstocks in the car pool and direct them instead into the aviation section. And there are a few other things there as well. Monitoring is the one at the bottom, I guess, is another important one, is the actual ability then to track the impact of sustainable fuels, how they're developing over time, and how the airline is actually able to demonstrate that it is meeting some of these objectives. So improved monitoring and improved technical support as well to help people as they're going through the approval process with jet fuel. A proposal is expected from the European Union sometime next month. So we should get some more flesh on the bone when that comes together. Meanwhile, and again, Bob mentioned this a little bit earlier, some of the airlines, the UK, the member states themselves are actually starting to take the initiative. So I've mentioned the 63% EU mandate target by 2050. Norway already has a 0.5% mandate in place. Sweden is focusing on an emission reduction, but is also mulling a volume-based mandate as well. France is looking at 1% for 2021. Germany is under discussion. But also airlines themselves are starting to take initiatives here in terms of British Airways has committed to, or its owner, the International Airlines Group, is committing to try and get to 10% emission sustainable fuels by 2030. Deutsche Post, a huge carrier of freight, looking to get to 30%. Boeing are looking to certify the use of 100% biofuels in their engines and their aircraft by 2030. So there are opportunities to come. I'm getting towards the end. I don't know how much time I've taken up here, quite a bit, so I shall try and wrap up quickly. But I focused on three of the sort of leading opportunities in technological terms that are here to try and hit some of those targets. HEFA, the hydrotreated esters and fatty acids. This is the one that is perhaps most widely used at the moment. It's the mature option. It's the technology works and is already underpinning current production and supply to some of the places that are trying to use sustainable fuels more regularly. It underpins much of Finland's Neste's current production, and they have plans to expand as well. In terms of emission reductions, it's rated at 85% versus conventional jet fuel. And the process uses a variety of feedstocks, largely oilseed based or used cooking oil, so UCO, vegetable oils, animal fats and animal fats and oils, palm oil fatty acid distillates, tall oil from forestry waste, amongst some of these things that can be put into these machines and producing high quality, both diesel and jet fuel. Alcohol to jet is another one that is small scale at the moment, but is showing promise and is being pioneered by companies like LanzaTech and Givo. I hope I pronounced that correctly. They're looking to unlock the energy from lignocellulosic sources that brings agricultural wastes into the mix, and it makes energy crops viable as well. It's very promising for a US perspective, where production could complement the existing and relatively sophisticated corn-based ethanol sector. The savings here are rated at 95% versus jet fuel, but they are still at the pilot stage. There are some funding issues to resolve, but there is major interest from both airlines and oil majors in some of the projects that are underway. And then last but not least, Fischer-Tropsch, which again is familiar technology that has been around and used before to provide liquid fuels from any sort of carbon-based origin. But this incarnation is in the process of scaling up, and the primary example, I guess, is Red Rock's Lakeview site in Oregon that is pioneering development using forestry waste as the primary feedstock. Now, I think, again, as Bob said earlier, there are still question marks over how much the funding is still required and how much growth and expansion is needed as well. But there are clearly signs that people are jumping into this pool to start trying to drive it, and oil majors and new energy pioneers are at the center of much of that development. So a final slide from me, a collection of headlines that we've put out over the last few days, just to sort of draw everything together, that there are new opportunities, there are new impetus that is likely to drive changes ahead, fundamentally with pathways in place for almost all other forms of transportation. The aviation sector has to move to adopt new approaches, but this transition is going to require all forms of alternative mechanisms to make it work. But the scale of demand that the aviation sector is likely to need is going to become clearer in the few days ahead. I once attended a conference, this was a few years ago, where a presenter delivered a sobering point on sustainable fuels in the US context, and made the point that in order to meet US aviation's needs entirely from a sustainable background, you would need to sign over 400% of total US farmland in order to hit that. So that's clearly not going to happen. So as these technologies comes online, so that scramble for feedstocks is only going to intensify.